Besides foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly.
Broadcast from later, we are exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal is just something that we notice, an event, an idea, an issue, or some development that we do not understand yet, but we suspect it might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives or society. As foresight strategists from later, we're steadily tracking and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on these broadcasts, we are giving a glimpse of what it looks like when you're trying to make sense of something that you don't know anything about. So it's kind of structured like show and tell. A few of us bring in a signal. The rest of us don't know what that item is in advance. And collectively, we're trying to make sense of it, speculate a bit about what it might mean. If you're listening and you feel lost, you don't understand what we're talking about, don't worry. We don't either. And I don't know anything. We're just trying to figure it out as we go. So today on this Vroom call, we've got Valdez, Erica, our producers, Jeremy and Serena. I'm Robert Bolton, and our guest is Luisa Ji. Luisa, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for coming, and it's great to see you. It's been a minute. Luisa's a friend of From Later and a collaborator with Nomadic Labs. Luisa was the designer behind our field guide to public space and Directions to Nowhere in particular, which is a game of chance that prompts new ways to sense, make, and navigate public space. And you can check out at www.directionstonowhere.com. You're also studio lead at Wukai Projects. Can you tell us what's Wukai Projects?
I'm not sure if you know this form of fishing. It's called Wukai. It's a special thing in Japan. So when the founder of Wukai Project, Jerry, told me about the fishing process of the fisherman having a relationship with the bird, a really big black bird, cormorant, that fishes and stored fish in their long necks. So the fisherman will take care of the birds, take them out in the middle of the night, use fire to lure the fish out. The birds will go fish the fish and store them in their neck. And at the end of it, they empty out the bird for the fish and distribute the fish among villagers. So it's a horribly inefficient way of fishing, but it has this beautiful, cruel, weird, wonderful story that you have to really sit down and make sense of. And it's such an embodied practice and has a certain ritual and aesthetic to it. And it's at the end, it's everything. Like it all comes in cycles. So Wukai Projects is sort of like that. And we want to use this as a container to tell stories of fiction about arts practices and how do we bring art into life in a way that is embodied, people experience it, make sense of it in their own ways through their bodies. And of course, that also involves technologies that are emerging. So like AI and VR and all these amazing like computational achievements, like how do we bring life into it and how do we make new relationships with these technologies and these ways of organizing our lives. So in a nutshell, that's very confusing. And
I love that, actually. That was super helpful to me. It may or may not be to people without the same background and context on Wukai. It's funny, when you said fishing, I thought you were going to say that the Wukai is a particular technique of PHISH fishing.
Yeah, I think it is, though.
That I like. That's like to me a brilliant one-liner to explain like an art and technology studio. Like we're a particular type of fishing.
Fishing for weirdos. I love like working with artists who hold particular ways of understanding the world and like more than just making something look pretty or like. So it's definitely fishing for people like that.
Your words that I read online about your work being informed by the polyphony of the natural environment. You kind of demonstrated that just now, but I was wondering if you could speak to that and how it informs the way you think about the work that you do.
I'm pretty sure you've seen New Not Normal. And I was so struck by how people responded to the map, not just in using it as a map to pin down messages, but also like the intimate messages that people sent to the map. And it's all, like it's attached to emotion and nobody really can see it until they like click through all the little dots on the map. that was the moment of like, what a wonderful thing and weird moment it is on the internet that we can all have our voices and without being pinned down to who we are. And it's such a contrast against, like social media or algorithms that kind of want to steer our behaviors a certain way. It's like, oh, like polyphony is just like we can make sense of the world like in ways that just like the ways we are and the ways we want to share with the world. And somehow that over the past few years, it evolved into a major part of the process of creating art. And also like now extended to more than people. And like, like we're in the process of the intelligent terrain residency right now, working with 3 artists. And a huge part of the question is like, how do we work with the relationships that's being formed from like our work, like the artistic work, with the landscape that you're bringing the work into, and how does the relationship change once you start introducing yourself and your world into another kind of set of worlds. Yeah, so it goes down like a lot of like rabbit holes, but it's so beautiful, and I think it's so important in a way that like we have to acknowledge these relationships if we are going to say tackle the climate crisis. Like how do we re-engage with the world so we understand the emergency, not just as like somebody is telling us that it's an emergency, but it's like, how does your body feel? Like how does the creatures in the forest feel? Like, how do you make sense of like how everyone is feeling?
See, all of that, why you were the perfect person to do all of the design work on Directions to Nowhere and the field guide to public space as well. So well done and appropriate.
So I was in Kananaskis, Alberta, the past week, and on a hike, I was pulling that out to show people, hey, like, what should we do on this hike? So that was like a wonderful project. I thank you so much for like bringing me to that.
Thank you for doing what you do on it. And then speaking of intelligent terrains, true or false, you once spent 3 days shoveling manure just so you could take a warm shower powered by that very shit.
Yes, true.
Can you tell us about it?
I think it's called like biothermal reactor. But basically, so when you make compost, it's supposed to go to a certain temperature, but you can push it to a hotter temperature, which if you sustain that with the right amount of carbon to nitrogen ratio, you can run a coil of water through the compost, and at the end, it heats up the water and you can take a hot shower, which is like brilliant. But yeah, it takes a lot of work to set up and like maintain the temperature. So it goes to about like 70 degrees Celsius. And there's like a science that you have to like calculate that I don't understand. But I was very struck by the fact that it actually worked.
Yeah, I think it was super cool. It must have been the best warm shower ever.
Super pile of shit.
I always like that particular story. So thanks again for being here, Luisa. We'll jump into it. Valdez, we'll start with you. What's your weakest signal?
I brought the Backrooms. It was a meme a long time ago. And it's gone through those cycles of people being like, oh, it's like become too popular and like it's over now and it's all been ruined, to like moments where there's new life breathed into it. And this year, that breathing moment happened because somebody actually made a mini series on YouTube all about it. And Backrooms is like a meme that started on Reddit or 4chan that was like about these kind of bizarre liminal type spaces that are they're not like destinations and they're not like homes. They're kind of, you don't really know what they're for. And so like, if you think of Backrooms, think of like abandoned offices, the areas of like hotel conference centers when there's nobody there, and people would just share photos of those with like very mismatched like drapes and carpets, and they just have a real creepy feel to them. I think that's why they took off online. But then somebody started making this like YouTube series based on the Backrooms phenomena, and uses a lot of like VFX animation through Blender. He's using like an open source 3D software package, and it's become very popular. And I just find it so strange that like there's like a new media forum online, which is like the social media entertainment phenomena, and people like build up their followings, and they do all, they'll like do DIY videos and videos about where they just like explain things, or there's like a few little genres like that. And now there's also this kind of like memes turned into like feature length movies or whatever, but all done like on your own. So yeah, I don't know what to do with it. There's also like the memory aspect, like why are backrooms like interesting? What is it about these like spaces? I've watched ones too where like people they'll just walk for like 20 minutes and they're in the back of a hotel and they cannot find the exit. And it's just they're moving through like all of these giant abandoned spaces. It kind of reminds me like when I was in university like a decade ago, we used to like explore like old abandoned buildings and stuff like that. It's like now I guess people share that through the internet, but there's a kind of layer of strangeness added on top of it, like a collective story is taking place, like it's being built up through the sharing of all these individual videos, and people are kind of like making sense of some, I don't know, strange reality that exists in our midst that we didn't notice it before. And it's partly they're creating that experience like through sharing it. They're making it more creepy by sharing it.
I actually kind of like that though. It's like urban legend, but now you have a way of like experiencing it.
Yeah, it's like a distributed urban legend. That's exactly it.
It's strange in a way, but it's also like people find communities in these things. And I don't know if you feel this way too, but during COVID, my world shrunk literally to where I live. And the moment of like exploring the world is either through these weird internet moments or like work or something that forces me to go outside, like directions nowhere.
It's a good fit with that. So as a meme, these backrooms, what was the form that it was taking originally?
People would share like a picture and either they would have a caption with it, or people would then start contributing like captions that were kind of like Lovecraftian, like something bizarre is happening, but you'll never point at it. The point in like Lovecraft is you never actually see what's terrifying. It's always kind of just hinted at in the background. And so these photos take on that feeling, So that's kind of how they were shared.
The desire to recreate it in a virtual form is pretty fascinating. And to me, it relates to all these things that seem to be happening in VR, like wanting to create a waiting room. These things that like you normally would think we would want to remove from our virtual experiences. But as it turns out, it's like exactly what people want.
Or there's some kind of weird feedback loop, because you just made me realize that like the backrooms look like what video games used to look like. So a lot of the pictures that people share, the backrooms, there's nothing in them. So like the way like Doom or something, we couldn't render very much, and so you would just have walls and floors. And these backrooms look like old like 90s video games. Like they look like what video games used to look like 30 years ago.
So it's a good place for a paintball match or a first-person shooter.
They always kind of mirrored what was unexplainable about dreams sometimes, like the way they were kind of stitched together, their little empty little fragments of things. And so I find some of the renders that you find, they have that sensation of like something that's dreamlike. Maybe it's dreamlike or nightmarish.
It reminds me of the conversation you and I have come back to and circled on for, I think, years now, about just being against the idea of experience, wanting to go visit like the pyramids and making a point of that. And I just put that as like one example that it seems like people like long to do in the course of their life and are enamored by and think it's romantic. It could be the Eiffel Tower, the whatever, these things that are meant to be, it's going to be this romantic experience, are never the things that are that special. And experience is just happening wherever it's happening. And you could have a thought in one of these spaces that's more meaningful than anything that comes up when you make a point of visiting some idealized place.
I have been like hiking outside of Toronto a lot, like along the Bruce Trail, things like that. But I often say, and I still haven't done it, but I'm like, honestly, I just want to go for like 2-hour walks through like Markham and stuff like that. It's a suburb outside of Toronto, where they're like building homes and they're all in the last decade. And you'll drive for like 20 minutes and you won't feel like you'll have moved. It's like a treadmill or something. And I'm just like, oh my God, to walk through that for me, who's not used to it, would be really interesting. And these back rooms, like the same thing. If I could get access to them, maybe I just got to go look, and I'll find some in Toronto, like the Path or whatever.
Let's go foraging in a business park.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
That's like how I
Like,
feel.
what kind of
like
species of chair and wallpaper is this?
Mm-hmm.
That's like kind of how I feel. Like, I don't know if I've just like taken the train recently when it's like super late and like nobody was there. It just like reminds me of that. And you're like the only one. And then it's like actually a pretty romantic vision, like to be in there, like when you think back, but like being there is like very unsettling because it's like, oh, something can come up, like someone, can just like show up and like unexpectedly and something could go wrong. And like your mind is just like staying on high alert. But then you like think back, it's like, oh, it's like, like in the movies, right? Like you're like there waiting and then the train comes in and you're the only one.
Right. From signal perspective, is there anything that we think this could represent about where things are going, whether that's around the technology creating it, how people are using it, something about the desires and the nostalgia of it that it tells us about people? Anyone care to speculate on where this Backrooms thing goes?
It's not in a nostalgic way. It's in like our unconscious, subconscious is like shaped by the architecture around us, and we've internalized that in lots of ways. Like churches used to, before printed books, used to literally be organized to help people remember things and experience things. So different like symbols would be placed in different places because like people didn't have reading materials. And so this was the way that like certain symbolic functions would be achieved. It still happens in the present. We just don't think about it as much. And so like, yeah, our interiors are shaped by a lot of these different, like both real and virtual spaces. And the fact that people can't differentiate them, like if somebody renders a backroom in Blender, I actually thought that video I shared was only aliens that were rendered. I think it's the whole thing now. After I think
It's the whole thing. I like watched someone I don't know, just like commenting about it. And
so there you go. I thought it was like a real space. I thought you just
built the whole space in Blender and the camera. And the way that they made it look real was like slapping a VHS filter on top of it. So it somehow like matches the way we like perceive these things.
It's strange because we're like intervening in each other's memories. Like memories are not just stored; they're created every time, or at least according to the contemporary theories, they're created every time you recall them. So they're not. It's not just like in a location and you pull it up or whatever. You're actually creating it every time, and like the fact that these videos kind of trigger that process in us, like we're like collectively recreating strange memories.
So do we think signal or noise? Let's start with you, Erica.
It's a noisy signal for me just because that meme has been around for a little while, but it depends on like your circle of like your render community or what kind of like gaming community you're into. Maybe there's a bunch of backrooms popping up and that's like the whole game or that's the whole render. And yeah, I'm just really curious to know what people actually do in those instances or web pages or what have you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Luisa, what do you think, signal or noise?
I think the collective memory part is signal. I'm not sure about like whether like the ways like anyone makes a space look real, that kind of part of it is signal. But I do like really feel for the like collective memory making, collective fiction writing, and you like look at these spaces and you try to like fill in the blank.
I would add the Freudian model of the psyche that had the unconscious, the id, the ego, and the superego was based on like Victorian homes, or at least like it had a parallel to that structure. So now the Backrooms is whatever the new version of the unconscious is that we're going to experience going into the 21st century, some kind of like bizarro, blur between digital and physical and collective and individual and whatever.
I like that interpretation. I was about to say noise, but you convinced me at the last second here about this signal. Luisa, do you have a weak signal you can share with us today?
Sure. I don't know if you've seen these like very cozy videos going around, but I saw one recently about snails and how they make certain decisions using two brain cells. And I thought it was so cute and lovely.
These
And
guided meditation ones, right?
yeah,
I know
and
these
it's
ones. I
like, oh,
follow.
it's snail time. You know, you only need two brain cells. Like, chill and like have some moss. Um,
Yeah.
and then I was like actually looking into the two brain cells. So it's like I think it's two neuron types. So it's not like strictly two brain cells, like literally, but it's close to that
Mhm.
enough. And it's like very goal-oriented decision making. So, like for example, if you're a snail and then you want food, one neuron type sends the signal that there's presence of food, and then the other one makes a decision of like how you can get to the food with the least amount of energy from your body and eat the food. So that's how, you know, like a complex decision of eating gets made with the two brain cells. And I think the paper, it's on Nature, and the scientists were like, oh, we can like this design robots and other like forms of computational strategies to minimize resources and have higher efficiency, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, this is literally the chillest thing you can do with your body, and shutting down everything, let your two neuron types, you know, your two brain cells make all the vital decisions like getting food. And you choose to capitalize on the fact that it uses very little energy, and then you can design more efficient machines.
I see. So I guess if I can try and like summarize back, like the idea that this knowledge was generated through scientific research that of how the snail decision-making function is kind of working and how efficient it is or how simple it is. And then we have these two outputs, right? Like one is this pretty humorous guided meditation, be snail time. That's kind of making like sending up, definitely sending up itself and sending up like the whole meditation wellness kind of culture, but also kind of cozy and feels good as well. And has something actually that's nice to take out of it. And on the other hand, with this knowledge, we can get more productivity. These two very opposite sort of interpretations. I like it.
Do you know how the two neurons interact or anything like that? Is it kind of like the way a thermometer works or something? Like one of the neurons, because the neurons are continuous, so like it'll like be going down or something like that, and then at some point it'll be triggered, and the other one it'll switch to like the other one. Or do you have any idea
I have no idea. I think it's the one that you mentioned like prior, like the before one. The only thing I took in was that it's only in situations where there's like a goal involved. So like getting food.
It looks like, just from a brief like scan of it, it looks like what it says is that one is like kind of interoceptive, like it's scanning the interior body state of the snail to be like, is it hungry or not? And the other one is exteroperceptive, meaning like it's signaling whether there's like food in the environment.
Is it just neural, or is it like something to do with like the mucus and other types of like sensing things going on with snails? I'm wondering what else they're like tapping into to communicate.
I absolutely feel like there's something with the mucus. Well, because that's how snails come in contact with surfaces and like how they feel.
Sorry, I just imagine that like the little trails that they leave have so much like written in them that we obviously can only see like a little slimy path, but I always imagine that that's like their writing or their primary form of communicating. But that's me just not knowing all that much about snails.
Is there a particular aspect of it, Luisa, that you think is more the direction you see things going, if you were to hazard a prediction? Or, what are your views on like where this leads to?
Science will definitely pursue this, right?
And engineering, I guess.
And engineering. And it might not be a bad thing. Like, it was just going around feeling like we consume so much energy for like non-important things. And like in converting one energy source to another energy source and then using it. Like maybe that's a direction, like if people in the engineering communities do take that seriously and have like machines that are less energy consuming, where like that's just like a little low achieving But I also feel like the collective consciousness thing with like these social media based like meditation, that also fills a void in like maybe that's the way people discover nature now. It's like it's through these moments.
Yeah, for me, I mean, the most interesting part of the signal that maybe is like in aggregate with other ideas that I feel people have been exploring is putting in some effort to imagine what it would be like to be a species other than yourself, which is something that's out there in neuroscience papers, or even to just be anything else. Like I know Alice right now has an art exhibition in Berlin right now about like what is it like to be infrastructure, like internet infrastructure. What is it like to be a router? What is it like to be these things? And there seems to be this imaginary sort of empathy with other species, objects, things that communicate, things that have some form of intelligence that's other than human and perhaps seems less complex than human. And there's many different reasons to do that, to engage in that process of trying to feel like what it would be like to be a snail. So that side of it for me is like the really interesting behavior that's going on. And I think especially when it's coming from something more like imagination, more internal, less something that you're doing through a game, because of course people kind of role play through games and things like that as well.
Yeah, like imagine you're like slimy and then you feel everything that you come into contact with.
Yeah. And do that with your human brain power, but imagine you have only enough for, very basic, goal-oriented, to do this sort of chill thinking of the snail. I think it's kind of a beautiful way to focus, or to focus your mind and attention. Valdez, signal and noise feed.
I want to say a signal of some kind, just because it like makes me pause. I don't know if like the neuron thing is as much a signal, but definitely the fact the like Instagram video and the kinds of analogs that people are trying to take to figure out what like forms of life they should have is kind of interesting, and using online platforms to like exchange inspirations from like other insects and animals. I remember like when Allison brought that example of like people on Facebook becoming ants and like pretending to be ants and just like lift, everybody saying lift, lift, lift in the comments when like it'd be a photo of cheese. I mean, that was like a lot more creative, but I think there's something like that there in this one. So, but yeah, I'll say a weak signal in the sense that I don't have like a clear idea.
Erica, what do you think? Signal and noise.
I'm not sure about the neural part of it as well, but generally I think this like working with snails recently in like K-beauty, like snail stuff has kind of been everywhere. How to use mucus, how to use snails in a particular way. And I know that's a little different than how snails are organizing and like their terrestrial strategies, but there is a lot to learn from snails at any point, I'm sure. So I kind of like the idea of like this strange like economy around like snail tending perhaps popping up. And you see that with just how people are observing them. So I think that could be interesting, but I don't know if it's necessarily happening.
For me, on the signal and noise, I lean into this like, what is it like to be something else question, and it goes back to like the old, what is it like to be a bat paper, the sort of like seminal and consciousness and mind-body problem and so on. But I think it's cool that if there's like a mainstreaming of just questions around like, what is it like to be a snail? I love that. So for me, it's a signal. Snail time. Erica, what's your weakest signal?
My signal is on ketamine and K treatments. So ketamine is being prescribed as a drug that can treat mental health and a variety of different conditions. K is like usually used as like a tranquilizer for horses or a party drug, and now it's being used for therapeutic treatments. And it's not like MDMA or psilocybin or LSD or DMT or any of those kind of psychedelics, because those are really only available in, I guess, clinical trials or in retreats. And so that's why there's like this strange focus on K right now, because you can legally have clinics that are virtual dedicated to it. And so there's all these like teletherapy K clinics kind of popping up as well. So that's my signal.
Ketamine teletherapy. That's definitely interesting. I hadn't heard of that. Valdez, you want to say something?
Just question like for what specifically, or like how are they
It's being used as a treatment for, I guess, a few things, but primarily depression and I guess anxiety, other behavioral symptoms. And so what I found interesting as well is that it's only been like in the past, I guess, 2 years during the pandemic that a substance like this has been able to been distributed in this way. And so it's just because of the loosening of regulations during the pandemic and there being more teletherapy health that K has been kind of situated in this space where there can be clinics dedicated to it.
What I heard was that it boomed in the last 2 years because like COVID messed up all kinds of supply lines for drugs, and K is just like cheap. It's like really cheap relative to other drugs.
That's exactly it too. It's really low cost. It's not really covered. It isn't covered by insurance. So there's no like a generic version of K.
So all these telemedicine clinics, like where do they source it?
From what I understand, it is legal. And so they are producing it in like a controlled situation. I guess the DEA permitted medical providers to prescribe K as a controlled substance. And that wasn't allowed before 2020. So yeah, now you can get like mail order psychedelics. When you do enter these like monitored situations, they give you like a little box. It has your dosage and it has like a mask. And then there also has like, it's paired with, I guess, music. And so in these sessions, you end up putting your mask on, doing the dosage, and then being guided through a therapy session and then diagnosed. So I found that interesting too, just that there's all these other little products popping up as well. There's one, I think, called Trip. And it's an app. And then there's one called Journey, which is a decentralized clinic model, which I think actually answers your question, Luisa, where is the K being sourced? There's these controlled production of it, and that's where they're getting it from.
Previous generations of like treatment to like mental health disorders or like depression has been like primarily focused on like blocking certain receptors, and that makes the other signal stronger so you feel better. But like I'm assuming that this functions the opposite way. So you like go through these like experiences and you feel like stronger, and then you kind of like leveling your kind of like baseline. So you have less of a drop between sort of like your baseline and like how you feel.
The sense I get is that it does do, yeah, you're right that it doesn't block anything. The benefit isn't because it's in your system, it's because it does something to your neural pathways, like helping them like regrow or something like that. It doesn't rely on inhibiting serotonin uptake. It like relies on something in your pathways. But it's strange because it's like a depressive. It's not a psychedelic as far as I understand.
From what I read from the testimonials of like people trying it and reporting on it, yeah, it's a break from like a certain line of thought. So something that actually I read through Vice was that they're curious to know like if you're actually getting the therapy that you're promised, or if it is mostly just the administration of K that's happening with a company like Mindbloom. I also thought that it was weird that there's just like online pharmacies and teletherapies that are increasingly, I guess, imperative to what's available. So now K is available and more readily accessible.
Interesting. Yeah, lots changing there. Valdez, what do you think on signal or noise side of things here?
I think for a lot of people, it's a signal. And for a lot of parts of the society, it's a signal in the sense that it portends some kind of disruptive change of their idea of what is acceptable and unacceptable inside of society and what kinds of drugs can be used for what kinds of instances. I think, yeah, similar to Backrooms, like it's been around for a while in terms of like even like them testing it for stuff. I don't know if like those trials have like proceeded and been very successful, and now it's like the next phase and they're scaling it up or something. I mean, my take in general on those kinds of therapies is I think they're probably, if I were to have to say, like overrated, just because I don't think the model that we have of mental illness is just being like an individual problem really is makes sense. Like the way I described like extended cognition, like so much of what goes on that you think is your own personal experience is not your personal experience. And we live in a culture that so valorizes the importance of people's like interior lives, but so much of your interior is just like Lego bricks from the outside feelings that you have, you know, like there's so many elements that are not really in the way that we think of them personal. And so like I have nothing against like psychedelic therapies. I just don't, they get hyped like so crazy as like the next, well, they literally call it the next frontier and this and that, and it'll change everything. And I'm like, I don't think so. I think it's good. I'm glad that it's going to happen, but I don't think it'll solve depression. I wouldn't want it to.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems unlikely in that way. Luisa, what do you think, signal and noise?
I think I agree with Valdez on like there are just like so many other factors that contribute to our collective poor mental health and collectively wanting to seek treatment, and goes with like the whole like self-care or like there's something wrong with me, there's probably going to be a drug that fixes me. Yeah, like I feel like there's a bigger problem with how we organize our lives around that contribute to depression and things that we treat with medicine right now, but can probably be treated with like better kind of like community building or like connections to each other or like relating to the world a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there are also like very strong evidence of like if you organize your schedule a certain way, that like changes your like how your neurons work. Again, this is like I'm not
The answer isn't
understanding part of
ketamine,
this.
it's Snail Time.
It's Snail Time, and Snail Time can literally work to like help you, regulate your hormones, regulate your like things that your body internally knows how to organize.
Yeah.
It's just like the conditions are not met, like you're stressed or like you're like worried about paying bills and all that. So yeah, like I'm not sure, but like as a short term, I think a lot of people needed it. Like a lot of people can like totally benefit from it. So like if people find that helpful, probably it's worth it.
Here's a very speculative take, which is that like if any of these life extension technologies that are promised actually end up working, and some of these Silicon Valley people get to live to 180, one of the issues that I've always like wondered is that childhood exists and death exists linked to that because childhood induces this moment of extreme plasticity in the neural connections, and so you're kind of acclimatizing yourself to a particular kind of world. And as you grow older, those connections tend, not always, but tend to like get more set in their ways. And so one of the benefits of psychedelics is to loose them up, right? And so I think for a lot of people who are quite stuck in their ways, psychedelics are like a very powerful experience. But I mean, if you kept like a kind of childish disposition your whole life, it's maybe less of a wow factor. But anyways, if these life extension things work, maybe psychedelics will be the way that they like refresh their ability to not just become like a husk of a habit weighed down body that can't like adjust to a changing world. If you're like 180 and you grew up in a world of like Betamax, and like who knows what the world will look like at that point, but you definitely will not be adapted for it. So maybe psychedelics will be a way to artificially inseminate adaptation into the aging silicon boomers.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a strong signal. It's definitely something that's happening, but the ways that it does, not like where Valdez took it, just for pure new ideas.
I just wanted to add that, yeah, I think the point of emphasis here is less on K, because yes, it's been around, but more so on the outcomes of the virtual treatments. So there are lots of companies popping up that are administering and doing these like virtual treatments. And although virtual therapy has also been around, it's just the mixture of the two, I think, that makes this like a signal.
Cool. Thank you for that one. Broadcast from later.